Good afternoon. My name is Adrienne Foose, and I'm an assistant professor of marketing at St. Bonaventure University. Today I'll present my work titled Elaborating on Conflicting Product Reviews, Information Processing and Attitude Certainty Over Time. Business-to-consumer messaging is typically one-sided, meaning consumers receive positive information meant to persuade them in favor of the product or service. To find alternative information about a product or service, consumers often have to seek advice from others or search online for reviews. To pursue this alternative information, consumers need interest, motivation, ability, and opportunity. To be persuaded by alternative information, a consumer would need to be uncertain of their original attitudes toward a product or service, deliberately process the alternative information, and become more certain of their attitudes over time. Online marketing channels allow consumers to access alternative product and service information easier than ever before. Internet searches for a given product or service may yield combinations of positive, neutral, and negative information from different sources on the same page of results. Consumers no longer have to expend as much effort as in the past to find alternative information concerning products and services. However, they do need to expend more effort to process the sheer volume of alternative information regarding products and services. This shift in the source, valence, and volume of information creates a more dynamic relationship between consumers and businesses. It raises questions about how deeply consumers process positive and negative information about products and services, and how the depth of processing this information affects their attitude certainty over time. Since marketers cannot limit the exposure of consumers to negative information about their products and services, what kind of response can they expect? Message framing refers to the presentation of information in a positive or negative manner. Messages that are differentially valenced and non-equivalent are messages that validate and then invalidate a position. For example, it's the best computer I've ever owned versus it's the worst computer I've ever owned. The effects of these types of messages are important for marketers to understand because they reflect the nature of the online reviews consumers read prior to deciding to purchase products or services. Exposure to positive information should result in favorable attitudes toward a product or service, and exposure to negative information should result in unfavorable attitudes toward a product or service. Despite the logic of this conventional wisdom, there are many factors that may influence a consumer to focus more on positive or negative information when making a judgment. Factors influencing the retrieval of positive or negative information to form judgments include time and effort. Initial attitude impressions reflect the valence of the information presented because people tend to form quick impressions in an attempt to limit cognitive effort. These initial impressions tend to endure unless further cognitive processing effort is expended. In other words, when processing effort is low, people base evaluations on their initial impressions. However, delayed attitude impressions are likely to favor the information most elaborated on during encoding. According to researchers, negative information itself may be more elaborative due to its perceived informativeness. This leads to the first hypothesis of this research, that participants exposed to positive and negative messages will demonstrate more elaboration than participants exposed to positive messages alone. Attitude certainty is a metacognition that refers to the feeling of validity or correctness of one's attitude. Attitude certainty is a consequence of elaborating on attitude-relevant information, because consumers hold their attitudes with more certainty when they perceive them to be based on a consideration of both the pros and cons of an attitude object. It follows then that receiving conflicting positive and negative information should lead an individual to elaborate on the validity of this information, potentially increasing certainty over time in newly formed attitudes. Attitude uncertainty in the face of conflicting messages should motivate individuals to expend cognitive effort to validate the attitude, and elaborative evaluations may result in more deliberate and persistent attitudes over time. Hypothesis 2 says that participants exposed to positive and negative messages will experience increased attitude certainty over time compared to participants exposed to positive messages alone. To test Hypothesis 1, an online longitudinal experiment was conducted using participants recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk. Participants were randomly assigned to one of three groups: a positive message group, neutral message group, or positive and negative messages group. The stimuli took the form of product reviews for a fictitious tablet. Participants were presented with one or two reviews from a fictitious website similar to Amazon.com for a new tablet. Attitudes were measured during both sessions. Participants were asked to list their thoughts to measure the level of elaboration, and demographic and manipulation check questions were asked. About 10 days later, MTurk workers again filled out the same attitude measures. A total of 125 participants completed the experiment. To test Hypothesis 1, a one-way ANOVA found significant differences between groups in terms of level of elaboration, with a positive and negative messages group with significantly higher levels of elaboration than the neutral or positive message groups. This result indicates a relationship between message valence and level of elaboration, with the positive and negative messages group more likely to have higher elaboration than positive or neutral groups, as indicated in this figure. The null hypothesis can be rejected because the results show that the positive and negative messages group are more likely to elaborate during information processing than the other groups. This suggests that the addition of conflicting information encourages individuals to consider the merits of the arguments presented in the messages. While attitudes did not significantly change over time, the results demonstrate different levels of information processing occur in each group. This conclusion supports the need for further testing to examine level of elaboration and attitude certainty over time. To test Hypothesis 2, participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups: a positive message group or a positive and negative messages group. For the second experiment, participants read messages regarding a resort holiday on a Caribbean island. Participants in the positive message group read a fictitious positive advertisement for the resort modeled after online advertisements for Sandals, Jamaica. Participants in the positive and negative messages group additionally read a fictitious negative review modeled after reviews found on TripAdvisor.com. Attitudes, elaboration, and demographic questions were the same for Study 2 as Study 1. The recruitment and experimental procedures were also the same. Participants were asked 2 additional attitude certainty questions during both sessions of the experiment, 10 days apart. A total of 99 Amazon Mechanical Turk workers participated in the experiment. To test Hypothesis 2, a repeated measures analysis of variance found attitude certainty significantly increases over time for the positive and negative messages group. This result indicates attitude certainty increases over time for positive and negative messages groups, but stays stable for the group exposed to a positive message only, as indicated in this figure. The null hypothesis, therefore, can be rejected because the results show that attitude certainty increases over time for the positive and negative messages group. Attitude certainty remains steadily high for the positive message group. The level of elaboration finding from the first experiment was not replicated in the second experiment because both message valence groups displayed a moderate level of elaboration. Attitudes also did not significantly change over time. This conclusion supports the conjecture of different types of processing occurring over time for different message valence groups. The findings from the first study show that participants elaborated more when presented with conflicting online reviews than when they merely read a positive review. The findings provide empirical support for the hypothesis that exposure to differentially valenced, non-equivalent messages results in higher elaboration. It is possible the exposure to the negative message triggers elaborative processing by confronting participants with conflicting information from the positive message they accepted. The second study essentially sought to understand if participants validate their attitudes over time when confronted with conflicting information. The findings show that participants' attitude certainty increased over time in the positive and negative messages group, but remained stable and high over time in the positive message group. The stable high attitude certainty in the positive message group indicates the automatic acceptance of the arguments in the advertisement. The low but increasing attitude certainty over time in the positive and negative messages group suggests a deliberative, time-consuming process to counter-argue the negative review and accept the positive advertisement. The first experiment suggests negative reviews trigger deeper elaboration on message information. For marketers, this means that contemplating negative reviews balanced with positive reviews are not bad enough for consumers to reject a product or service outright. In fact, the attitudes toward the product in the second session were neutral for all groups. Marketers should encourage consumers to share and read reviews so that they may deliberate the pros and cons of purchasing a product. The second experiment suggests that negative reviews result in uncertain attitudes toward a product, but that attitude certainty increases over time. For marketers, this means that the presence of negative reviews might push a consumer to validate and strengthen their positive associations with the product or service. Consumers affirmed in their positive attitudes toward a product or service may resist further negative information. Marketers often focus on immediate effects of information on consumer attitudes. However, this experiment suggests important processing takes place over time. Again, marketers need not be dismayed by negative reviews, but should instead encourage consumers to validate the truth of their advertisements. The presence of negative reviews may in fact strengthen their case. The complexity of interpreting the results of longitudinal experiments necessitated the employment of simple dependent measures. Future researchers may pursue the measurement and interpretation of mediating or moderating variables or other interaction effects. Relevant variables to consider include accessibility diagnosticity, involvement, attitude strength, beliefs, behavioral intentions, among others. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to contact me at the following email address. Have a great day.